Thanks so much, Karan. And you mentioned a number of things that we want to delve deeper into in this conversation. And, obviously, you know that AFT is a strong supporter of the role of community schools and the potential for the expansion of those. The voice piece is incredibly important. Let's dig deeper a little bit on the equity question for a minute. And I want to turn to Linda on this, and welcome back, Randy. Obvious effect of the pandemic is this exacerbation of inequities of various kinds, from access to remote learning, to devices, to just having a place where you can do stuff to learn at home and be away from your siblings. One of the most disturbing local examples I just heard is in Chicago. Fewer than 60% of kids are believed to be online at least 3 days a week. More than 80% of the students in Chicago public schools are Black or Latino, and the log-on average is lower among those students. So we are losing kids, at least temporarily, as we see these inequities and this lack of access. What are some of the strategies and ways to address? How can we alleviate some of these really dramatic challenges of increasing inequity, which go even to how kids with the most severe and most specialized learning and other needs have the least access to the services to support those needs during this time? Lindy,
well,
you
you've already sure. You've already referred to the inequities in access to devices and connectivity, the digital divide, as we've called it. And, this is, to me, it's at the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs right now. We have to close the digital divide. We have to do it right now. We should do it by fall. We're working on that in California. We've closed our digital divide by about half. Across the country, about 15% of kids don't have access to connectivity and devices at home. And there's some number of teachers who also have not had access to connectivity and devices, at home as well. And here's the reality. It's not just whether we have distance learning, in this next few weeks as people are kind of finishing up the school year. We are going to be in and out of school. Schools are going to open and close again with waves of COVID. People who are exposed or symptomatic or sick need to stay home. They need to be able to access education. We have to have every kid with device and connectivity. We just have to do that. It's not that expensive. One estimate said that we could basically have everyone wired up and able to engage. And look at what we're doing now. I mean, this is made possible by our ability to be engaged in this way. It would be about $5 billion is what one estimate I saw. Now we're talking about trillions and trillions of dollars in the various recovery acts that we have. In California, we estimated about 1 in 5 kids was not connected. Our school districts have been magnificent. They've dug into their reserves and bought computers. We've done outreach from the governor's office and the state board to corporations and philanthropists and so on. So we're probably down to about 10, maybe 8% of kids who are still not, fully connected. And it will cost us a couple $100 million to close that divide. We've got to do it. It's got to be priority number one. Because for the kids who are unconnected, where you can get the human connection, right? It's nice to get a packet, but that's not the same thing as, having somebody who's in touch with you, who's, engaging with you in places that are doing this well. So often it's small groups as well as large groups. It's office hours that teachers are holding for kids one-on-one. Those same kids, however, who are unconnected are in the families that Karen was talking about, who are experiencing the most difficult aspects of COVID. And so imagine having no connectivity, having no telehealth, having no capacity to apply for benefits online, to seek employment online, to call Instacart to bring your groceries so that, grandma doesn't have to go to the store and be exposed, to all of the people with the virus. We have to do this. We need for devices and connectivity to be treated like telephones were once treated. You know, the FCC has a role to manage the regulations. Every state utility commission has a role to treat the regulation of this as something that every family has an entitlement to, and then we've got to just put the money in to get it done. So there's a lot more we can say on the inequity front, but I just think that for us to be diddling around, you know, not actually getting that solved does not make any sense right now in a country where everything we're doing is so reliant. So I'm a little bit passionate on that piece. There's so many other aspects of the equity questions that I know other folks will want to also chime in on. And I will say that one of the other things I think we should be supporting school districts to do when we go back to school is developing an instructional continuity plan, so that everybody kind of knows, you know, when we go in and out of school, here's sort of what the plan is for each grade level. And Teacher Miami did that a while back because of all the floods and hurricanes they have. And over time, with support and the resources that are needed, we can also do that have an instructional continuity plan for students with disabilities, for students that have particular needs when they are at home. How does distance learning, you know, work for them? It's not something you can do overnight. You know, I was talking to the superintendent in Los Angeles who said, well, we would, you know, have to immediately redo 70,000 IEPs if that were required in the spring. That's not reasonable. But over the course of time, as we realize that we're in this new normal, we can start to build in these kinds of strategies so that you know, kids are getting supports that are useful to them when they're in and out of school, and teachers are not having to make it up at their kitchen tables, you know, every day. And the system is actually supporting this new way of working.
Thanks, Linda. I want to ask if anyone else wants to address this inequities question and then turn to some of the bigger cost issues for some of the kinds of things that we're talking about, and then dig further into a little deeper into virtual learning. Randy.
I think so I really appreciate what Linda has done in terms of the international comparisons too, because, you know, we're starting to learn and we're going to have the International Summit next week as well. We're starting to learn the kinds of things that are and are not working. Part of what the connectivity issues are so important, whether or not it's hybrid education, remote education, or a supplement to in-school education. It is not. I think that as educators, we also have to be assured on the K-12 front that this huge experiment with remote has made it clear that it is not a substitute for in-person learning. I would actually make the same argument in terms of higher ed, but at least in terms of K-12, it's not a substitute. We need to figure out ways that we pressure cable companies, not just to get more money in terms of E-rate, but we pressure cable companies to actually create connectivity for all families. You know, today we just, our uploading situation in our home was not working. So we had Spectrum in our home for 2 hours this morning trying to do all this. It cost us, and we can afford it, over $200 to do all that today. We need the cable companies to actually give connectivity for free during this period of time. And if we need to actually get more federal aid to do that, we should get that. But that is going to be what helps solve problems in a place like Chicago, in a place, that's what Detroit did, a place like New York City. The cables are there. It's different than in rural areas where you have to create the broadband. And that's part of how we solve the digital divide. Creating a coalition between ourselves to actually make that happen in terms of connectivity?
Thanks, Randy. A number of the things that we are talking about here have a cost, and not just the connectivity, which is, as Linda noted, in California, there's a price tag on it, and it's not that bad. But there are a whole bunch of other really challenging resource questions related to the broader economy and what is happening for state and local governments that is going to have tremendous deleterious effects that we are seeing already on the ability of school systems to be able to provide services. I know, Linda, we're going to lose you in a few minutes, and I want to make sure LPI has also done some work on this question of state and local resources that would be required, and what the federal government role can be in that. Karan, you just mentioned launching the campaign for the HEROES Act today. Randy, this has been occupying a huge amount of your attention. Jackie, obviously, the healthcare considerations in all this have a tremendous price tag as well. So let's talk a little bit about the importance of being able to, not being able to because we can, but devoting the resources that we need, and what that looks like, what we need to fight for, and what we're talking about. So, Linda, you want to jump on that one first?
Sure. I think I'm now unmuted.
Yes.
Sure. And thanks. I'm really sorry I have to leave on the hour, but glad to get it going. And I know everybody else will be able to chime in on this. This is so important. Back when we had the Great Recession in 2008, the ARRA put money into schools for staff stabilization, and it was about $100 billion. And we managed to avoid laying off about 275,000 teachers as a result of that investment. Thus far, in the CARES Act, the amount of money that was allocated for K through 12 education was about $13.5 billion. Out of trillions, in that act. So well under 1% of the budget, and not enough to do more than, try to help people in their emergency needs for, some of these things like buying devices and technology and so on. So we did some estimates of what would it actually take to stabilize schools, because the economy cannot reopen if schools are not stabilized and safe in all the ways that Karen and Jackie and Randy have described. And so if you think about the costs of just being sure that the 15% of kids who did not have devices and connectivity get them, the cost of the extra meals that schools have been providing for families, often entire families, and all the kids in the school, just so that people are not going hungry, the additional costs that may be needed for social and emotional supports. This doesn't even get into what the costs might need to be if there were more staff needed for physical distancing or PPE, equipment. And if you take that and also look at what the estimated drop in state revenues is likely to be, which we could calculate how much state revenues go to schools in every state, what the anticipated drops are in state revenues as a function of the economic shutdown, and using conservative numbers of a 5% drop in state revenues this year and a 20% drop in state revenues next year. We said, well, how much would that cost for that money to be replaced so that schools could be stabilized, could bring their staff back, and try to manage what is ahead of us? And the number was about $230 billion. That's a relatively conservative estimate of what will need to be found in terms of resources for us to kind of continue at steady state, meet some of these additional needs, not all of them, because as Jackie said, we're learning more all the time about what it will take. And so in the HEROES Act, there's I think 100 billion for education, not all of it for K-12. So we're getting closer to a level of stabilization. But it's really important for people to look now ahead. There's an argument that we shouldn't put money out on the streets for education, even though we're putting billions out for airline companies and for other corporations and so on, until it's needed. Well, schools have to plan on an annual basis. They have to enact contracts on an annual basis. They got to look ahead for the whole school year. They can't say, gee, we've got enough money till Friday. Let's open schools. And so I think part of the challenge is making the case that we know quite a bit about what the economic downturn is going to do in terms of revenues. So we should be planning now to stabilize some of our core institutions. And schools have been the heartbeat of communities during this crisis in terms of the community schools work that Karen talked about, the meals that are being provided, the connectivity, the ways in which schools are providing those devices and connectivity for households that need them in multiple ways. So we have to be able to think about how over the coming year, we're actually planning ahead for schools to be able to function well.
Thanks, Linda, and thanks so much for being with us. I know you only have a few more minutes, but it's been really enormously helpful to have you.
I will put a link into the chat for those resources also. We actually have, for state by state, we've done an estimate for every state of what the situation looks like given the way schools are financed in that state, what the needs of students are, et cetera. So if people are interested in looking nationally or at their state, they can do both.
Fabulous. Thank you. Randy, I know this is a question you very much likely want to weigh in on as well, and probably all of our panelists do, in terms of state and local resources especially.
I think I'm glad that Linda just raised all of that. And I mean, we already saw last month more layoffs of educational personnel than in the entirety of the 2008 to 12 recession. And, so this notion of, it was good that there was $150 billion, including that $30 billion in the Education Stabilization Fund in the CARES Act. And the fact is that in the HEROES Act, even though $100 billion, I think, is too low, what the House of Representatives for strictly for education, what the House of Representatives did, which was very important, was they put a maintenance of effort on that funding so that you couldn't have you get the education funding that is solely for the use of education, but a governor could take state aid away in a different way. People need to see the real impact of all of this in terms of what it means for real families. The rubber hits the road for families when you start talking about public schools, public universities. That's where most families in America, 90% of them, have access to their kids' learning and to food and other kinds of really important primal needs that Maslow and others have talked to us about. So I think that seeing what these cuts actually mean are really important. So thank you, Linda, for doing that. But I also want to make a second point, which is that to reopen safely, even before you consider what Kiran said about wrapping services around in community schools, to reopen safely these buildings, you need to do the physical distancing and you need to do the other resource needed tools like cleaning. So like having PPE, like including masks. And so when someone actually says we're going to reopen and not provide the resources for that, they're really actually saying they don't care if kids get sick. And I think it's really important that we make that clear. It's not reopening, as I said before, as if we're going back in time to June 1990 or June 2020 or June 1919. It is really trying to make sure we have the resources necessary so that we can do both assure to the extent practical. Nobody's going to assure in 100% everyone's safety. We don't do that right now. But to assure the reduction of or prevention of disease in a school with the education needs. And without that, we're not going to be able to reopen schools. And without reopening schools, we're not going to be able to robustly reopen most of the economy. That needs to be clear as well.
Thanks, Linda. Bye-bye. Karan or Jackie on this question of resources and what it will take.
Yeah, so one of the things I will name is, again, I am not an economist. Most of us aren't. So when we get into what this will cost and how we do it, I think a lot of people do feel out of their depth. I want to echo, though, what Randy has said, and again, lift up, right, this campaign that AFT is running, that EROS is running for, at least in one instance, the passage of the HEROES Act that we think will move some of the resources that we need. The other thing, though, and this is again a conversation that both educators, parents, students have been saying, that when we talk about resources, when we talk about equity, before the average person tries to become an economist to answer that question, but the departure point for this should be that this is when we talk about America. I grew up in Jamaica, very different sort of economic situation, but in America, when we talk about resources, we are really not talking about can we afford it. We are talking fundamentally about, do the folks who are in leadership in Congress have the political will and the political commitment to do what we know is necessary? And that is the conversation I have with parents and students, especially when they say, but how can we afford this? I go, listen, I may not have the answer to that, the formula. What I do know is that we live in the richest country in the world, and that the money that we're talking about from the HEROES Act, which again is only, according to calculations, is only an estimate of what's really needed. We know we can actually afford that. One of the books, I've been doing a lot of reading during the pandemic, and there's a book I read, We Are the Weather, that talks about the environmental crisis, but one of the chapters is dedicated to how the federal government dealt with World War II. And in 1944 to 1945, we saw the most progressive income tax in the US, right? It's a 94% tax rate. And incomes of over 200,000 were taxed at a certain, and that's how we raised the money, right, to fund the war. And one of the things that people have been saying is, I read an article just last week, Jeff Bezos is now on track to be a trillionaire, right? So I don't even know what that means. What's $1 trillion? But what it does say to me as a lay person, as an organizer, as a concerned person, is if folks like Jeff, right, are on track to becoming trillionaires, but their tax rate, is not what everyday people are paying in taxes, that to actually afford resource in schools the way we need to make us safe and to make learning possible, is one thing we can do, is actually tax folks who can afford it, who aren't paying taxes, right? Who aren't paying their fair share. Again, I'm not saying don't be rich, don't make money. But I'm saying is, if you are making money, then it is only fair in a system that relies on income taxes for you to actually pay your fair share. And so when people say, can we afford it? I go, absolutely, because until the very rich are paying their fair share, then I'm not willing to entertain this conversation of can we afford it or not? Because we can. And we've seen precedent when the federal government had the muscle and the political will to do what was right in the interest of the common good, that we found the money to do it. And that is the message that we are sending to parents as we invite them to engage on this HEROES Act, to say, demand it. Because we are not asking for something that is unreasonable, and we're not asking for something that is not within the capacity of our federal government and our economy to provide.
Thanks, Karan. And you might want to put the name of that book in the chat, because I have a suspicion that a number of people would be interested in that.
I will.
There are a lot of great questions in the Q&A, and as Leo noted, there's no way to get to all of them, but we don't need to put up a slide on how to ask them, because you've clearly figured it out already. So I'm going to try and combine some and continue with the questions that that Leo and others thought were important for us to ask at the same time. And I want to direct something to Jackie right now that combines a couple of things. So one is the question of how close are we to a vaccine? What's reasonable? What do we know? And related to that, given what you said about how what we know is changing every day about the science and public health issues, how do we and how do educators and public health officials plan for fall? How do you plan knowing that your plans are going to change?
So it's a great question, and I appreciate that. And there is so much uncertainty that I think one of the things that we have to recognize is that there is this uncertainty. But within that uncertainty, we do know some things that are true that will remain true. And part of it is the modes of transmission and how we can mitigate that. So those are the things that we can plan based on what we know now, because that is not going to change. So I think what we need to do is understand that there may be modifications that need to be made. But if we stick with the plan based on what we know now, and a lot of the basic tenets are there, it's spread by people speaking, people talking, people coughing, people singing, people sneezing, and mitigate some of that. Hand washing is essential. The masks can help because they will. And here's one example where things changed. Early on, masks were not recommended for the public, but now masks are recognized as a way of decreasing the community spread, because what it does is if you are infected, and particularly if you're asymptomatic and not realizing that you may be spreading the virus, then you are going to, by 60% or so, by that mask will decrease the amount, you will lessen the availability of the virus to others. So that is something that has changed really over the past 2 to 3 months, where now everyone is advised to wear a mask. That's the type of thing I'm talking about. So we take what we know now, we include that, and it might be that we, temperature checks is another thing that people have asked about. Only about 40% of people present with a fever. This isn't like SARS-1, where that was the presenting symptom, and it made it really easy from a screening tool, because if you didn't have a fever, you weren't expected to be contagious. Unfortunately, with this virus, not everyone gets, only about 40% are febrile. But it still will collect people who may have some kind of illness that are just on the cusp of becoming contagious. And that way they can be shepherded off, they can be quarantined away or moved out, and it may not all be COVID, but at least we know enough to move them out of the classrooms and get them isolated so that they're not spreading anything to others they may encounter. So those are some of the things. what else do we know? We know that people have certain risk factors. And one of the things that we do need to address is those who are most vulnerable, whether it's the children who do have a lower infection rate or a lower symptomatic infection rate. Of those who have been infected are the special needs children or those with underlying medical conditions that mirror the adult population. And we know that there are certain risk factors in the adult population that make it more likely, not just advanced age, and but also if people have underlying medical conditions such as chronic renal disease or hypertension, or some of which are very common. So we know that, or if you have an autoimmune disorder and you're on medications that suppress your immune system, those are folks that we need to really make accommodations for in the workplace, as we would do for any other workplace. But this is a special situation, and hopefully it will not be a permanent situation where those accommodations will be required. So take what we know, plan based on the science. At the time, we're going to have to make the decisions, but ensure that we are capable of making changes to some of the basic rules if the science dictates that we must do that moving forward. So I hope I answered some of that. And luckily I didn't have to talk about the costs, because that wouldn't be in my area.
You did address the question. It was terrifically helpful. Thank you, Jackie. I know we are on target to end in the 12:30 range, so want to cover a couple of other areas. And Leo, I know that you'll interrupt me or give me the high sign if I'm forgetting something I should be doing. But I want to make sure we spend a few minutes on virtual learning itself, on instruction, on the core, one of the core missions of schools, not the only core mission of schools, and look at that from the teacher perspective and from a family community perspective. I know Randy and I have been in some of the same conversations where what we learn, and a number of our leaders are on the phone, is that teachers and administrators have done an incredible job of figuring this stuff out as they're doing it, in terms of what is and isn't working with distance learning, how checking in on kids is a heck of a lot more important than what percentage of the curriculum you're covering. Let's talk a little bit about what to focus on as we think about reopening and going back to a blended environment, which for all the reasons we've talked about is going to be blended for some time in the future. And what should we be focusing on to enhance virtual learning, to make it possible for teachers to have the freedom to teach, for families to be able to stay connected to what's happening for their students. I want to start with Randy.
So this is, this is really going to be the heart of what happens over the next, I would say, 4 to 24 months. And I say 4 to 24 months because things will change if like the Spanish flu had 3 cycles. The third cycle, there was never a vaccine, but the third cycle was much less. And then we saw it, diminish, although we have a strain. I'm looking at Jackie as I'm saying this. We have a strain, of the flu right now, and we have we have a flu shot but not a vaccine that stops it. Polio took a while to get a vaccine. Smallpox the same, measles the same. So we need to, that's part of the reason why I think it's important that people are not in a situation of saying, okay, everything's going to be fine tomorrow or everything's going to go away tomorrow. We're in a period of time where we're re-envisioning a new normal, and so hybrid or blended, or having some degree of remote reinforcing education, at least on the K-12 side, is going to happen. I'm a little worried. I'm very worried about what happens in terms of higher education when people think that they can just move this to online podcasts, remote distance learning. I think in both of these situations, as Herculean and as amazing as people's efforts have been, it is what actually proves the point that in-person learning becomes really important. So I think we need to actually take a step back in terms of learning from teachers who actually, far more than tech companies, have now become the experts on remote learning because of what they've done. And frankly, if I was a tech company right now, if I was Google, if I was any of them, Apple, any of them, small or large, I would be knocking on our doors right now trying to figure out how you could create focus groups with teachers on what they learned about how to move curriculum, and you know, in a pristine situation of remote learning, and then also in a situation like in Chicago. And we could actually teach people a lot, both in, you know, about how this really works, and teachers can. What I have heard from teachers, and as people know, we've been asking teachers a lot, and we will be doing a couple of big polling exercises and data and getting real data from our members, you know, starting in July. We tried to wait until late in June, July, because we didn't want the data during the period of time when people were in extremis. We really want to get what people have really learned from this. And I suspect what you're going to hear is what you just saw in the Ipsos poll that USA Today did, where they saw that 2/3 of teachers said, yeah, we kind of figured out how to do this. We are working far harder than we've ever worked before, but we don't actually really think it works in the long term. People jettisoned, so that's number one. But there are things that can work, probably in terms of reinforcement and probably in terms of, you know, continuing some degree of capstone projects or project-based instruction or things like that. It probably does not work in terms of real introduction of new materials and the ability for people to really build, kids to really build relationally on the work that they do. I think that's what the data is going to teach us. And the other thing that the data is going to teach us is that it shows us, frankly, that you could not simply move from what the school day looked like to doing exactly the same thing in remote. You couldn't do that practically for families, since so many families, you know, what happens if Kieran had math at 10 o'clock in the morning and Randy had math at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and frankly, there was only one computer in the house. I mean, or what happens if Marla had another such situation? What happens if Randy's lunch in school time was at 11, Kieran's was at 12, and Marla's was at 1? So we learned pretty quickly you couldn't just transfer. And then the last thing I'll say is that we've also learned a lot about how much time you can actually be on a screen and be effective. What do you need to do in terms of being able to walk around, being able to think? And so there are rules of the road in terms of all of that we've learned. And I think it's important for us, as well as other education groups, to actually kind of come up with a lot of these best practices as we go into July and August.
Thanks, Randy. Karan.
I would say, again, I want to echo much of what Randy has said, and the piece from the parent community side that I've heard the most as parents juggle, again, being at home and supporting young people, is, again, the technology piece and how we make sure that we are developing curriculum with either the abundance of or the lack of technology in homes as part of our thinking. The second thing that comes to mind, again, to reinforce what Randy has said, is collective decision making. Like that for too long, educators, school staff, parents, students, the folks who are on the front lines impacted or having to implement processes and protocol are not part of the decision making. And while, organized groups like parents and unions have literally in many places forced themselves to be at the table, we want it to become more part of our normal everyday thinking, that if we are making decisions about what school should look like, what curriculum should look like, the people who are charged with teaching must be at the table and their experiences must be taken into consideration. The other thing is around, again, what can and cannot be taught through the screen, right? So I've heard parents lift up project-based learning as an opportunity, right, to expand that. The other thing is to think about the trajectory, right? That we do not know when this will all end, but there is an expectation, even based on the previous examples that have been named, that there will be a post-COVID world. And so one of the suggestions regarding curriculum and instruction that I've heard from parents and community folks is, how do we imagine front loading, right? If we think about our existence as on a spectrum, right? So at some point we're in the COVID moment, at some point we won't be. Are there lessons, are there curriculum material that we front load now as we are dealing with sort of remote learning? And so we literally are reconfiguring curriculum to say, here are things that people can reasonably learn and comprehend while at home, while on a screen. And then think about a time when we are back in classrooms, socially distanced or otherwise, and how do we accommodate for that? So that it's not simply about adjusting whatever we're teaching now or whatever is part of the curriculum to being at home, because we know some things just don't work that way. But there are some things, right, that can: project-based learning, book reports, reading, right, discussion. There are things that can suffice in this moment. And then thirdly, and I echo what has been said, that from parents and community folks are saying, this is not this cannot be the final iteration of what schools and learning looks like. Right. And we know that the folks on the other side of us are already, I think about post-Katrina New Orleans, right, thinking about how to make remote and online learning the norm. And I'm hearing unequivocally from parents and community folks and educators that whatever we thought before now, we have now been forced to learn that will not suffice, right? That we have to find a way to integrate learning, right? If we have to be online, yes, but also how do we solve the problem of in-classroom instruction and community learning and all of the lessons that we learn by interacting with other people. Like, those cannot be abandoned, and how do we solve for that as well? Those are the things I'm hearing from parents and community folks.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Karan. It looks like, Jackie, it looks like you want to jump in on this question. I want to do a quick follow-up on something that Karan said, then I'm going to come back to you. But before I do that, I have to shamelessly promote AFT's Capstone Project Collection, because my team and our colleagues around the country worked so hard on it. If you go to sharemylesson.com, you will find an amazing collection of projects by grade band that can be used at whatever level of technology is accessible to you, as a way to sum up the year, as a summer opportunity, or even a way to kind of figure out where kids are when things come back in the fall. But so do check that out. But Karan, one of the questions from the Q&A box relates to this whole notion of voice and decision making and connecting with parents and community. And one of the questioner wondered, do you have a suggested list of kind of guiding questions to engage with community around learning issues? Do you have some resources for the kinds of conversations that you and Randy have talked about?
Right. So I will say this. We have been working with the community engagement team at AFT, and something is being developed, right? And folks will push that out in a little bit. There is stuff on our website, sort of pre-COVID coalition building voice, reclaimourschools.org, but we are working to actually develop something that speaks specifically to this moment as a tool and as a guide for the set of questions that we can ask and answer as we prepare to engage meaningfully with parents, students, educators, and school staff. So that will be online pretty soon.
Perfect. We will look for that. Thank you. Jackie.
So as a parent of two teenagers, I've taped them saying, I can't wait to go back to school. I want to go back to school. I want to see my friends. I want to be in school. And I'm taping it so that hopefully when they're back in school and they're saying, oh, I hate school, I can say, hey, I got you here. You wanted to go back. Here you go. One of the questions that I forgot to answer or didn't have time was about the vaccine. Someone asked a question about when the vaccine might be available, and that goes to the planning. So we know vaccines take time, and we have this warp speed initiative that's moving very quickly. The fastest vaccine that's been developed was the mumps vaccine. It took 4 years. They're trying to do something that's never been done that quickly. The reason that we get flu shots every year is it's based on something with modeling and prediction based on differences in southern and northern hemisphere on what can be put into it, but it's not a novel virus. There are hopes that there will be something that can be available perhaps by the end of the year, although I think that's overwhelmingly optimistic. I think it's more likely to be in the first quarter of 2021. I think that's what Anthony Fauci was saying yesterday. I think that probably is more realistic, and what goes along with that. And I saw something earlier in the news this morning, or in the medical news, about 1 billion viral containers or whatever is being developed so that there can be widespread availability of a vaccine if it does become available. Let's see if that comes to fruition. Some of the pharmaceutical companies are getting together so that there is the viral adjuvant, which allows the vaccine, not the virus, the vaccine to be administered. So this is something we're going to have to think about, where our plans may be. We can't count on a vaccine. Not everyone's going to vaccinate their kids, or the adults are going to vaccinate, because we have a proportion of folks that don't believe in one of the greatest public health interventions of all time, which is vaccination. But those people will choose not to vaccinate. But for those who do, it won't be ready in all likelihood until 2021, if everything goes well.
Consistent information on that, but sobering every time one hears it. Thanks, Jackie. I noticed that there are a number of questions in the Q&A related to worker issues, workers' rights, what happens for educators and other school staff who might have health issues, and what options they have in that regard going back. Things like specialized instructional personnel, and how we are already hearing that some are losing their jobs due to resource to budget cuts, and how important they are. I want to mention, because we don't have much time to go into it, and I'm going to give everyone on our panel in a second an opportunity for a quick last word of advice to folks who are listening in and trying to figure all this out in whatever their day job and their family life is about. But just wanted to mention that we do at AFT, and especially for our members and leaders, have a number of resources and upcoming webinars that address some of the issues related to collective bargaining, workers' rights issues, involvement in planning. So keep an eye on your email and AFT social media to learn more about those things. And so before I turn it back to Leo, I want to ask Randy and Karan and Jackie if you wanted to offer a last word of advice or challenge.
You know what? So let me do this and just thank Linda, Jackie, Kiran, Leo, Marla, for this webinar. Every time we do any of these things, and I know we're doing a couple of other webinars for other parts of our union and other outside groups, you learn a lot more. And I've really been blessed to learn from every one of you. And I'm really glad we had so many participants with so many questions. With every question, we're learning more. We're really in uncharted territory. We've never done this before. Educators working with parents and healthcare professionals, we're going to figure this out. And particularly if we get the money from the HEROES Act from the Senate, and we really have to push to make sure they are held responsible in terms of getting that funding. But we'll figure this out. But it is only in, as Kieran said, that kind of collective work that we do together that we'll figure it out in a way that kids will be better off and communities will be better off. COVID has exposed every inequality in America. It's up to us in our activism, as well as who we then elect, to actually make this better. But we need all of us to do it. So thank you for listening. Thank you for all the participants. But all the participants who are listening, your questions are critical, not just for yourselves, but for us to be able to think through what else we need to do to help do this planning together. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Randy. Jackie, Karan?
I will say
Last
that
words?
to answer the question of how do we safely reopen schools, again, it is not rooted in can we afford it? It is about how we all act together to bend the political will in the direction of our agenda, right? The question of how we reopen schools safely is one about collective decision making. How do we make sure that educators and parents and students and community and school staff are at the table making the decisions? And so we are encouraging people to build local task forces that can do that. It is how we reopen safe is about, do we have the resources? So we are asking people to take action, right? Call in your senators, write in op-eds, write into your senators saying we need the HEROES Act and we need even more than that. And again, the question of how we reopen safely is about how each of us on this call and the people we're connected to, how we take care of each other, rooted in a serious commitment to both love and equity. So that's it. And it's been good. And I thank you all for the invitation to be part of this meaningful dialogue.
Thank you.
And thank you for including me in this. It's always refreshing to learn. And one of the things I do want to stress is that building on what Karan said about collective decision making should also be involved in healthcare decision making. And if you are a teacher or you are a staff member and you have concerns about whether your health condition puts you at increased risk, then you need to have that discussion with your physician, and you are protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act that will allow you to have reasonable accommodations. If this is the time where we're going to have some in-school learning and some out-of-school learning, then it may be that the folks that cannot do the in-school learning be identified as those who are going to be the ones getting the virtual learning curricula that they can develop and they can work on. And those who are capable of going into the schools, who don't have risk factors, that they are the ones who do the in-person learning, if things go that way. Hopefully they will. But I think people also need to make sure that the decisions they're making about going back into the schools are based in science, not purely in fear, and that it is not because I heard this one did that and that. I mean, the anecdotes that prevent the truth from coming forward are detrimental to all of our health and well-being. So I think it's important that people have discussions with their doctors, identify if they should be doing this, and be proactive about this. Have these discussions now to say, hey, I know I've had this or that or whatever health condition it might be. Do you think if the school's open in September or August, is it safe for me to go back and be exposed? Get that and have that identification now rather than the last minute shuffle where you may be forced into a situation where you don't feel comfortable. But you need to make sure that if you don't feel comfortable teaching, then that's going to be reflected in how the students are taught. And what, as an occupational physician, it's critical that we make sure that there is a safe working environment in a school. It's not just a safe working environment for the teachers, but a safe learning environment for the kids.
Thank you so much, Jackie. Great closing words and advice from Jackie, Karan, and Randy. And great to have an opportunity to hear from Linda for as long as we were able to. I want to thank our panelists so much for a really informative discussion. As you can see, if you've been able to look in the chat or the Q&A, it's generated a lot of questions, ideas. There are resources in the chat if you want to look, if folks want to look for any of those that you might find to be of interest. And most of all, thank you to all who tuned in to share and be part of this conversation. And with that, I will thank Leo for the opportunity of moderating and turn it back to you.
Let me unmute. Thank you, Marla, for having done, I think, a really wonderful job of moderation. 2 housekeeping details. This session has been recorded and it will be up on our website within a day, so you can share it with people who you think it might be useful. And we will also take the various documents that we have referenced and put them up together with it, so you all will have quick access to that. And so then let me just thank everybody who tuned in today. And let me personally thank Linda and Randy and Karan, Jackie and Marla for having done such a wonderful job. Have a good day.